We have two readings today. The first is our gospel reading because it is incumbent upon us as the church to proclaim the gospel each and every time we gather. So listen from the gospel according to Matthew to the word of the Lord. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds following his teaching. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against it. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, starting to walk on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The gospel of the Lord. Thanks. And then turning back to the Old Covenant, the first book of Kings, in the story of Elijah. And before I read the text, I want to give a little reminder, because when's the last time you read about Elijah? Probably not yesterday. But we've all heard of Elijah, right? We know what Elijah's all about. Elijah's God's special forces who he keeps kind of hidden in the desert until he needs them to come down and drop some judgment on a king like Ahab, the king who rose to power in the land and married Jezebel, daughter of a foreign king who worshipped the Baals. And together, Ahab and Jezebel instituted Baal worship in their kingdom. And the prophets of God, of whom Elijah was one, were rounded up and hidden in groups of 50. Only about 100 left. So two large populations of the prophets of God hidden away lest they be killed. And Elijah is the only one who's still functioning. And he comes down out of the mountain or out of the desert and says, there's going to be no rain. And there's no rain. There's a dramatic drought. And then, of course, he comes to King and he says, we're gonna make it rain again, but first we're gonna have a little contest, right? And you know what the contest is. Let's see whose God is real. And so they go up on the mountain and they build two sacrificial pyres, big stacks of wood to burn an offering, and they sacrifice a bull on the prophets of Baal and Asherah, and they sacrifice a bull on the altar to God. And he says, okay, whoever's God calls down fire, burns up the offering. Seen as the true one, right? And of course, you know how the story goes. 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah. They couldn't get the thing to light, regardless of everything they did. One prophet of God douses his bonfire with water 3 times and prays once. There we go. And everybody in the place, and this is important, everybody in the place said, "Surely the Lord is God," right? And they say it twice. Surely the Lord is God. Which in the Bible, if you say something twice, means you really mean it, right? And structurally, if you see that in the text, it means, verily, verily, like really, actually true. They were convinced that the Lord was God. And so Elijah, fresh off of this victory, does what? rounds up the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah and slaughters them. And the word of that action gets to Jezebel, and she sends a message saying, "May the gods do to me the same and more if I have not made your life like theirs by the end of the day." In other words, you dead meat. And he runs off into the desert, is miraculously fed, and after 40 days finds himself here, where we take up the story today. He came to Mount Horeb, or the Mount of God, and there he came to a cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away." And he said, the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, son of Nimshi. And you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat, I'm not going to say the word, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Lord, open our hearts to your word, that hearing it, we may come to know you, and in knowing you, love you more. Amen. It's fun, I think, to look at Elijah, because he's like I said, he's the special forces guy, right? He's the greatest prophet ever. You know that, right? So when you get into the stories about Jesus coming as the Messiah, what's the first thing people think? It's Elijah. It's Elijah coming back. And even now, if you go to a Seder meal, for instance, there's a chair reserved for Elijah, because we can't wait till Elijah comes back. He did more, to make God, real to the people. He did more to show God's sovereignty and presence than anyone before him, and arguably anyone after. Of course, anyone after, except for one guy who we know. But just a incredibly brave. Think about it. If you were the lone believer left in God, and there were, a combined total of 850 priests of another god, known, by the way, for the demand for human sacrifice, because Ahab's sin was turning to the Baals. And when he built the temple to them, he consecrated the altar with the blood of his firstborn son, and consecrated the gates of the temple with the blood of his youngest son, in obedience to the Baal. If you were facing that kind of adversary, would you ask them to meet you on top of a mountain for a little show of strength? I would not, unless I was Elijah, right? So, great guy. But then you read this story that we read today, and this is the end of his tenure as the prophet. Did you catch it there at the end? After this conversation with God, he tells him to go back and anoint Elisha in your place. You're not the guy anymore, right? There's a little more to go while he's training Elisha. There's some other things that happen. But this is it. This is the culmination of his public ministry in support of Israel. What brought us to that? When you look at what he did, I think, and again, I will freely admit that I look at these things and I think to myself, what is it that's going on here? Beyond what we already know. We already know that God is proving to the people that he is the Lord. Right? He is calling the people to repentance, and will do it through fearsome judgment, where only 7,000 will be left. Right? The people who knelt to the false god will be destroyed. We know that's going on. That's what the text tells us. But I look at it and I think, what's the human element that's at play here? And what I keep returning to is that moment of everybody proclaiming, surely the Lord is God. Surely the Lord is God. If you can imagine being in the story that we didn't read today, when the fire was called down from heaven, and you had seen the altar doused with water 3 times. And the scripture says to the point where they had dug a ditch around it, and it was doused to the point where the water was overflowing the sides of the ditch. And when the fire came down from heaven, it burned everything up, including all the water, right? It was completely consumed. Now, if you had seen that, and you're Elijah, and the people then, in response to that, proclaimed, surely the Lord is God, surely the Lord. And you could see the work is done, right? Why would you be afraid? You saw what God did. It was in response to your prayer. You stood on the mountain and said, Lord, show him! And he went, phew. And then the queen got mad because you killed 850 of her priests. We'll let that slide. She got as angry as you expect her to be and promised to kill you too. Why was he then afraid? He knew better than anyone the power of God. He knew better than anyone that if God chose to, he could wipe the whole kingdom off the map. Or that he could move a mountain between himself and the queen. He knew that. So why did he flee? And that's what I keep coming back to, that fear that crept in. And then, when you go to the lectionary and you read all the text, and this is an alternate text this week, it's not even the main text, but then you go back and look at what the lectionary puts before us in the Gospel according to Matthew, with Peter stepping out of the boat and Jesus calling to him to walk on the water toward him in the midst of the storm, and he does. The same question emerges. If Jesus just called you out of the boat and you are walking on the water, what are you afraid of? Why does he why does he start to sink? And the hint for Elijah comes in the text about Peter. When you look at he began to be afraid, right? You go into the language and it has a connotation of he began to think again. He began to reconsider. He began to reflect upon how unlikely this is. He began to think about himself. And when his attention turned back to himself, he retreated in fear. And that might be what's going on with life. Knowing that his life was now almost certainly forfeit if anybody found him, not wanting that cup to pass his lips, which is perfectly natural, and none of us would want it, fled to the desert. And not only into the desert, but a few days into the desert, and then 40 days into the desert, all the way back to where it all began, on the mountain where God handed down the commandments. And the demonstration of God's power that happened there, if you go back and read the account of Moses, was the same. The way God appeared before Moses was in wind and in earthquake and in fire. And when Moses was on the mountain, God was in those things to shroud his presence from the people, to speak only to Moses, to ensure that the law was handed down to, for whatever reason, was God's motivation. This time, it tells us specifically, line by line, God was not in any of this. Not in the wind that tore the mountain apart, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the quiet voice. What we often, tritely call the still, small voice. God was present in the peace that followed the trial. And I imagine that Elijah might have realized then what the mistake was. That God, who can call forth all the powers of creation and destruction, is not so interested in doing that all the time, in proving himself again and again, but in moving us forward in faith, in faithful relationship, so that we continue to build the kingdom that is his intent. And I think when we begin to look at our own world and where we are today, we are certainly in a time where there have risen in our world many idols, many false notions of divinity, and many false assertions about the direction that the world is headed and where true power lies. And we see this in every aspect of our world. We see it when a president of a great country so fears the political movements of a smaller neighbor that he chooses to go to war. We see it in our own politics when one side wins and is so frightened of the possibility that they will lose their grip on power that they then turn to destroy the opposition. We even saw it last week in the Women's World Cup. I don't know if you're watching that. If not, you should be. The U.S. is out. We lost in the first elimination round to Sweden, and they're doing really well. But did you see what happened after that? Oh, so many commentators so glad that they're gone now because they're too politically sensitive. It's not enough to say the best team won. Our fear that someone might have undue influence causes us to try to destroy it. It's not enough that the prophets of the enemy are defeated. They must be slaughtered. But the voice that guides us is the voice not of vengeance, not of hatred, but a still small voice of hope that says, I've actually got a plan for this. I've got this under control. And we're going to continue with the plan after you do one or two more things, one of which is appoint your successor. Done. The world is in a place where loyalty to God is no longer the norm. And the world is entering an era where we will see more of this kind of crisis. Some analysts argue that World War III has already begun. Some argue it's right around the corner. It's not inevitable, but it's likely. Maybe not a global conflagration, but continued war, continued unrest in our own society. The next decade is going to be hard. And I have no doubt that the Lord will be moving in it to bring about the kingdom. The project that God started on earth is the perfection of the earth that culminates in his eternal kingdom on the earth. But the road between here and there isn't going to look like any of us have imagined. It may take us into the desert. It may expose us to the wiles of our worst enemies. It may find us in a cave wondering what's next, and we may see great and mighty acts of destruction that shake us to. But the voice that will perfect the world is the one that speaks in the peace that follows. So gird yourself for the journey. And be sure to pack an extra measure of grace. Because it's in grace that God continues to speak and continues to bring forth his kingdom and will perfect you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, may his kingdom come quickly.